Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Dr. Jamison Green. I'm a writer and an activist and a former president of WPATH and legislative provocateur and somebody who's really, really interested in history. And we're all aging. Every single one of us. And it was really nice to hear the remarks this morning in the earlier session about the importance of the elders, and that's something that in the land to the south, just immediately to the south, is not paid much attention to. And trans elders, just like LGBT elders, are pretty invisible in most Western cultures. Anyway, that's the only thing I can sort of speak for. But there's a lot we don't know as a result about aging, even though we all are doing it. And we're going to do a few perspectives on aging for you and then open things up a little bit. So I'm just going to introduce the panelists real quick. And we have Jude Patton, who's a physician's assistant and therapist, and a longtime activist and learner of all sorts. And he's got more certifications and licenses than anybody I know. And we have John Otto, who is a Master of Library and Information Science, who works at the Seattle Public Library. And I forgot to say, Jude is located in the Sacramento, California area. I'm not going to do the whole bios are in the program, as you noted. Online, we have Dr. Maximilian Fuhrmann, who is a PhD geropsychologist in Southern California. And we are supposed to have Zander Keig, who is a licensed clinical social worker and located in Central Florida. We don't know if Zander's going to be able to join us, but anyway, Max is the real expert among us, and we're really, really privileged to have him with us. Let's start with Jude.
All right. One of the things that I'm going to talk about, probably the very little else today, unless I get questions, is what's happening with WPATH and all the other paths that has to do with aging. And I think you will see in the newest version of the SOC that very little is being done about aging. It's now 40 some odd years since the first SOC was written. I've been on several of the committees for that. And we've been activists, most of us who are sitting here at the table, to get more attention paid to aging. One of the things that did happen in this version is that we were added to the category of institutions. And that mostly formerly was about prison settings. And so the people who were working in prison settings were very annoyed that older people in nursing homes and other institutions were added to their SOC section. And we were very annoyed to be added to them. We think we should have our own section. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my life working on. Excuse me. However, some gains have been made because about a year and a half ago, the board members from US PATH contacted me and asked me if I would be interested in chairing a new, what was then called a subcommittee, and since has evolved into a special interest group as a label. And it's on aging and end of life services and interests. Max now is my co-chair, and we meet once a month, and we're working on hopefully some projects that will be more educational for people, initially for people from WPATH itself and all the other paths, but eventually, hopefully, open more publicly to anyone, even if they're not a member. And there are other things going on in aging that we know of, but most of what applies to ageism in general for any one of us who are aging also applies to us. We just have other things added on to our plate. And a lot of people don't think about the population even now, let alone what it's going to be by 2050. But right now, in the United States, I don't know about Canada. I'm sorry, I should have looked that up before I came here. But in the United States, about 16% of our population is under the age of 16, and about 16% of our population is over the age of 60. So even though we have these similar numbers and size of people that we need to address this for, we're just not doing a good job. All of the import has been given to children and youth, and not the people on the other end of the aging spectrum. Not that children and youth aren't important, but I think we deserve an equal break, frankly. I'm beginning to see, as people list from other organizations when they're having conferences and so on, since aging starts with A, I found when I read the list now where they're seeking materials or someone to submit a workshop proposal, they are asking for something on aging. So I'm hoping there will be more within a short time. I did attend Creating Change just in January or February, and they had several sessions on aging or bridging generations, which is also a big interest of all of us on this panel, that if we can just bridge the generations and have what you talked about, a little bit of respect, more than there seems to be for elders in our trans and non-binary community folks, I think that will do a better job of opening everything otherwise. For my own part in it, I continue to work as a therapist. I am semi-retired, but I work more than half time as a therapist, but I'm just working from home and doing online therapy. And for one of the ones that advertises a whole lot. And they allowed me to do my profile in your face, so to speak. I said exactly how I describe myself, what my identity is like, and that I prefer to work with my own community folks, LGBTQ plus community. However, I don't discriminate, and I will work with straight people. So let me put it in just like that. And fortunately for me, about 3/4 of the people they do refer to me are from the LGBTQ plus community. And then we don't talk a lot about, we talk about orientations and descriptions and so on and so forth, but we don't talk a lot about within orientation and within sexuality. I work with other populations, other people who have further descriptions of themselves and their sexual behaviors. So currently I have a lot of poly and pan and other description folks, kink and so on, and these are self-chosen descriptions. And I'm trained as a sex therapist and a sex educator. So it's just part of what I do anyway, is to interview people there. My own experience, I transitioned at Stanford University as far as the surgical transition was in 1972 and 73. I started hormonal transition in 1970. So that means more than 50 years. And one of the biggest, I guess, functions I serve at these conferences is young people will come up to me and they say, "Oh, are you the Jude Patton I heard about? You're still alive." You know, and I reassure them, yeah, I think I am, at least I'm walking around still. But I realize that my time is getting shorter too. This may be one of the very last in-person conferences that I get to travel to. I'm not, to my knowledge, not sitting on the edge of demise, but it's just frankly getting harder. You don't see perhaps many folks compare in terms of percentage of people who attend these conferences, because we simply can't get around that easily. And Jamison and his wife, Heidi, were very kind to me. They provided transportation. They helped me get my jacket off and on. And I haven't yet asked them to tie my shoes for me. I've managed to do that so far, but it's just the little things that start taking away from independence and some whatever form of dignity you have around that sort of thing. And so I'll leave it at that, and I will answer any questions that people may have later of me specifically.
Thank you, Jude. So in the order that we worked out, it's my turn now. And I'm going to wax a little randomly poetic, maybe, that about the fact that, you know, getting old is not for, as my ex-mother-in-law used to say, sissies. It's not for sissies. It's not for the weak. Even though you are less mobile, even though you have more pain, even though you have more, complications, physical, in the physical world, you have more complications in your life. But you also, if you've gotten this far, you are resilient. You have strengths. You have wisdom to a certain extent. And, to varying extents. But it's the resilience, I think, that is the most important thing. And we right now have, let me just digress for a second and say happy Trans Day of Visibility. And what we have, thank you, what we have is a very visible youth population under attack, under horrible, aggressive attack in almost every English-speaking country in the world, and a few others. And the resilience of elder trans people right now really needs to be seen for the benefit of those young people. They need to recognize that they can grow old. And even though the attacks that we're seeing right now are exceptionally vicious and done from places of extreme power, which is unusual, we've been here before. We've been under attack before. And we now have more allies than ever before. We now have more, people always worried, 30, 40 years, 50 years ago, you didn't want to tell anybody who your doctor was because your doctor didn't want to be out. You had to pretend you didn't know any trans people because you didn't want to be tagged as trans. And you might be tagged as trans if you were hanging out with them. All those kinds of prejudices that many of which we've overcome to a certain extent as a community. The doctors that work with us now are less inclined to hide. They are more inclined to step up for us than ever before. And they're putting their lives and professional lives on the line for us as well. And we don't all depend on doctors. It's the diversity that counts. We need to acknowledge that this is not 100% a medical condition. This gender variance is not a medical disease. It's not something we have to fight against. It's something we have to manage. And some of us choose a medical pathway and some of us don't. And that is just fine. And our young people need to see that there are older people out here who have lived through all of these oppressions in the past and have survived. And they can survive too. Thank you. So in some of my policy work that I've done over the years, I've worked with a number of different organizations. One is the Human Rights Campaign, and I worked a lot on their Corporate Equality Index. And that's how we broke the barrier on healthcare coverage. And now they are doing long-term care equality index. And it's brand new. They have a preliminary report now on their website that's available. And basically they haven't gotten very far. They don't have a lot of subscription to, they don't have a lot of long-term care facilities that are feeding data in. So we don't understand yet everything we need to understand because we don't have the data, but they're starting the process. And in that process, they've been able to analyze what some of the issues are. And that's what the preliminary report contains. And it's a roadmap that we can use to help us expand these levels of care to trans people. Another organization that really has a lot of resources that's becoming more trans inclusive and trans friendly is SAGE. What SAGE stands for? What? Senior aging. What was it? Yeah, right. Well, never mind.
Senior aging moment.
Yeah, there you go. There it is. You're witnessing it. Okay, so yeah, SAGE, it has more resources on their website. They're developing more trans-related programs and networks. So that's important for us. Laws and policies that affect trans aging people are different in every state, in every country, all around the world. It's impossible to summarize the things we have to watch out for. They're the same things, however, that we face throughout our lives as trans people. So we know what those issues are. How are we going to address them? That's another matter. And we have to bridge generations, and we have to bridge cultural awarenesses, and we have to bridge our trans consciousness, whatever that looks like, with the consciousness of the institutions or the organizations that we're trying to engage with. And it's important that we learn about who they are, just as we're trying to teach them about who we are. And because if we're going to build a stronger future for all aging people going forward, we're really starting from scratch. And so, but I'm still in it for the long haul. And I know that together we will somehow, we're just going to continue to survive until we don't. But on the whole, in the big picture, trans people are not going away. Trans people are never going to die as a community. We are not giving up. We will not be erased. We are here. Thank you. So in our planned order of things, Zander's still not here, right? He's out surfing in Florida. I don't know, but so we'll that's all right. We can give Max more time. So let's pass it on to John. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Besides having a master's degree in library and information science, and actually, oddly, what led me into that is that I have a bachelor's degree in transgender studies, or truly multidisciplinary gender and sex studies, which I was an older returning student. I went back to school very shortly after I started transitioning, and went back to the four-year university that I went to initially right out of high school. And I had already been diving in so deep into trans things for my own purposes, and also felt a responsibility to share information, because there was so much bad information, bad as in incorrect information out there in the community. And that really was the only sources, or virtually, not literally. There were a few other sources, but mostly it was within the community that we shared information. There wasn't the online presence that you see today. And through doing that is what ultimately led me to go and get my Master's of Library and Information Science degree. I was able to combine these two things into the one and only job that existed and now no longer exists at the National Center for Transgender Equality. I worked on information privacy and identity documents issues. I've given a lot of presentations over the however many years it's been, 20 plus years. But I don't normally speak on such a personal level is what I'm going to today. Normally, I'm interested in getting the facts out there, and in a way, I'm still going to do that today. One of the things that I always find hard, even when I'm focused on a factual thing, is it's so personal. It's so personal. It's private information that we're putting out there. Aging is very personal. For me, besides my own getting older, I dealt with my parents and their declines and passing away. And it took up 10 years of my life. First, my father got Alzheimer's. And then a few years into his Alzheimer's, gradually, my grandmother gradually took over more of the tasks that he had been doing. Then my mother was diagnosed with cancer. She passed away a year later. As I was navigating, trying to take care of things for my mom's, not only her health, and then leading up to her demise. Normally, my dad would be the guy who's doing that, but my dad had Alzheimer's, and his Alzheimer's was starting to get pretty bad. So I was very much stepping in, and also knew that I was going to have to, when mom, though not gone totally at that point, she was gone as far as being able to assist with anything with my dad for the last month of her life. And then it was me stepping in. But my dad was already really mad at me because he didn't understand what was going on. He thought I was trying to take over their lives. He also didn't always know who I was. And then once my mom passed away, then I'd figure out how I was going to navigate things with dad. I knew he shouldn't be living on his own. I checked with lawyers, social workers, doctors. There's at least one other professional category. And what everybody said was, you can't force him out of his home. You have to wait until something bad happens. But nobody wants to specify what something bad is. I filled in the blanks in my own mind and knew it had to be something like catching the house on fire, getting in a car accident and killing somebody, not paying the bills, getting the power and lights shut off eventually. My dad really was not amenable to any interference. He totally lacked insight that he had any sort of dementia going on. I could tell him, and the next second it'd be forgotten and it would be all over again. Or he just wouldn't believe me because he had no self-awareness whatsoever about it. So fortunately, my parents had their power of attorney papers written up in such a way that there was no what's called a springing clause, where somebody has to be declared incompetent or incapacitated before you could step in and exercise your power of attorney rights. I didn't know that though. I didn't know that until I eventually had an appointment with the attorney who said, no, you can do things now. But what I still couldn't do is force him out of his home, and he shouldn't have been living on his own. So I waited, watched, tried to give him enough leeway for 3 years. It meant that I went to visit at my parents' house Even after mom was gone, I still thought of it as my parents' house. I went there a lot, which meant going back to the small town that I grew up in. And it was a small town. I went to the same high school my dad and all his brothers went to. I had some of the same teachers. So it was me as my adult person in my 50s at that point, or early 60s, who was returning to this place that I purposely left very early in my grown-up adult life. It was not a place that was really going to further me, and I got the hell out of there as soon as I could. And now I was back a lot more and having to deal with not just going to my parents' house to visit them, but now starting to interface with all these people who had positions of authority. A lot of this, my God, sorry. Forgive me. A lot of these things that I was dealing with are things that anybody who's dealing with an aging parent or a loved one who needs help, that any of us deal with, or dealing with it ourselves as we get older. We all, if we live long enough, we all end up in these positions. And there's nothing really unique about it, except I'm a trans guy. And all the things personally that it brings up, all the obstacles I might encounter, all the people who maybe they didn't even know me growing up, but they knew that Bob and Marilyn have a daughter and it's their oldest, and my two brothers live in the small town still, and they know them because they come into that credit union all the time. And then there's me, who does have power of attorney and they don't. And like many families, my brothers were doing some things they shouldn't have been doing, taking advantage of my parents involving money. And they set some obstacles that made things more difficult, that eventually I ended up pursuing getting a legal guardianship over my father. What that means in practicality is for me, I became the parent of my father. And that gets complicated it's already complicated if you think about it. I mean, parents generally don't like having those sort of roles reversed. None of us like giving up autonomy, or even in my dad's case, he didn't even really realize he was giving up autonomy. Nobody was going to tell him what to do. But on top of it, I'm dealing with these other obstacles. One of my brothers, I'm not sure, because he didn't really talk, but I don't think he was so keen on me being a trans man. The other one was okay, but they both were opposed to me being power of attorney. I have no idea why. I don't know how this fits in, but this is pretty common. Family dynamics can be kind of a mess in these situations. From what I'm told from the attorneys I dealt with, it's rare the family that doesn't. So when you bring in the trans things that you're already sensitive about and trying to deal with, but you've got these responsibilities, it gets very complicated. I could probably talk the whole time slot, 75 minutes and more, and not run out of things to say. But there's some things I want to make sure that I touch on. I saw an article recently of the article's name from the New York Times. It's called "The Unending Indignities of Alzheimer's." When I read that, it really struck home. It struck home on two levels. The indignities of getting old. At times, we end up in places that we have to give up privacy in ways that we really never guessed or thought of that we'd ever have to deal with as we get older, but you do. And a lot of that involves the body as well. And as a transgender person, that can intersect with those things as well. You lose your autonomy. You can forget who you are, or you lose who you are in some ways. If you've read any of the literature on transgender aging, some of the issues that you see repeatedly come up is fears that people have who are trans, like, how will I be treated if I end up in a facility? If I'm lucky enough to end up in a facility, or even don't end up in one, will I know who I am? Will I remember that I'm my transition self? Who will take care of me? Many of us don't have children. How will I take care of me? How will I be able to advocate? My dad was very fortunate that he had me to advocate for him. I don't have anybody in my life who can take on that role. And that's true of many trans people. How can I pay for it? Any care that I need, a care facility. Generally speaking, trans people don't make the money that non-trans people do. If you compare it statistically, don't have jobs with benefits with those sort of coverages. Will I get proper trans health care? And also, often, who takes care of parents as they age is the LGBT grown children, because we're considered the ones, we're much less likely to have our own children. So you're the one that's available. In my case, there was another stereotype that came into play. I was the oldest. It often falls on the oldest, and it often falls on the daughter. And even though I'm a trans man and a man, not just a trans man, and been one functioning in society for many years now, not quite as many as you might guess, though. I was 45 when I started transitioning. I was still the daughter in the family. So, and also I was the most responsible one, so it fell on me. As we take care of our old ones, we become invisible to the world. The rest of the world doesn't really understand what we're going through. We're also often aging ourselves. When you go to a care facility, an adult care home where your parent lives in, or a memory care facility, and you see people's lives, I would say it's not the life that you think of if you think of winning the lottery. And when you throw in the trans thing, the trans aspects of everything, it just complicates things further. I also want to throw out really quickly, since I'm more oriented towards facts and have been for some time, I have a website that I've maintained for some time it's just a listing of resources on a sort of categories of transgender information resources. The website is Jotto, JOTTO.info. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Well done. So now I want to pass the proverbial microphone to Dr. Fuhrmann. Take us home, Dr. Fuhrmann.
Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. It worked well before. We'll see how it goes now. I'm very excited that so many people are interested in this topic. Are you able to see the screen?
Yeah.
Good. I'm Max Fuhrmann. I'm a clinical geropsychologist, of which there are 43 of us in the United States. This has nothing to do with trans issues. This is essentially working with older adults. So I was pleased to see that we have 28 people online and probably a whole lot more in the audience. This is not a sexy, uplifting, exciting topic. I have taught gerontology classes going back to the 1980s. I primarily work in private practice in Southern California with older adults and their families. And so there's so many things that people have touched on here about how marginalized, right? Marginalized older adults in general. And I'm going to generally use the term trans, but clearly we've got all these different identifications, not just in younger adults. People are very hidden in gerontological research. More recently, there's been interest in LGB older adults. But obviously, if people, when they transition back in the day, were told to remain stealth, they are not going to identify themselves. In California recently, in a number of government surveys, even things like renewing your driver's license, they ask you, what was your sex assigned at birth? And many people are choosing to lie because they do not want to be out to like the Department of Motor Vehicles. So this is another issue where we keep saying we need more research, but at the same time, the people are not wanting to actually be part of the identification. People do not feel comfortable accessing, in general, senior services. The long-term care settings that John Otto was referring to, most people never want to go to those. It's a billion-dollar industry. One of the things that I lecture on in retirement planning is planning, essentially. How can you age in place? By thinking about the future. But we know that people don't ever think about getting older, not just in the trans community, but in general. So when you don't have other resources, you don't have financial resources, you may have been less likely to have family support or children. It's one of the reasons in LGB research, we say that older adults are over 50. And I'm advocating that we consider like trans, gender variant bodied people as older adults at maybe 45, because they're far more likely to have health problems, isolation, loneliness, all these different kinds of things. So we don't know a lot, but this is a little bit of what we do know. And I didn't know I would have as much time, so I don't have as many slides as I could, but we know a little bit, and some of it's just kind of common sense. Trans-identified elders are more likely to have a disability, to be actually on federal disability, much less likely to access services and face discrimination when they do that. I once was a trainer in the National Resource Center on LGBT aging, and we would go around to senior centers and see if we could help them with programming for LGBT older adults. And generally, even in Southern California, they would say, well, we don't have folks like that here. Or conversely, we would go to LGBT centers and say, do you have any senior programming? And they'd say, well, people would never access those services. So in this one very brief survey that they did, they're saying that people were denied care. There's an old film called Generation Silent that profiles this pretty dramatically, that even before the more recent kind of uprise and hate against trans people, it was common in parts of the United States that you could be denied access to a long-term care facility, that you could be denied access to all different kinds of services as an older adult. So obviously that's going to contribute to not getting healthy. Individuals who transitioned before the 90s, as I was alluding to, were told actually that you were identifying with the pathology as it was seen in those days of being transsexual if you were out, if you even associated with people like Jamison Green was talking about who were trans. So the people are more closeted and disconnected from their peers. Middle-aged and older trans adults then really struggle to get peer support And even though they may be connected to cisgender people, have not really come out to them. So when it comes down to them like needing care, they may really not reach out even to their friends in that way. So a great deal of issues here as we go looking forward of reconnecting with people, as many of my clients do, with people that they went to elementary or grammar school with, going to high school reunions and this sort of thing as a way to feel part of community. Folks who have not ever come out to any of those people will not do that. A lot of underemployment. The study that came out, and I'm sure we're going to validate this even more in this recent big study that was again by looking at all these trans people across the country in the United States, that we have more education generally, but don't make as much money as our peers, our cisgender peers with that same level of education. So then this carries over obviously into what you can afford in later life. People may not even apply for Social Security benefits because they're concerned that then that outs them in some way. In the United States, you cannot change your Social Security number. And so if you've really not been out to the people in your life, that could be a whole big issue again. So one of the things I always try to do as a gerontologist is to get people in a good mood about this stuff. What can we do? It's like, here's the problems, like what can we do about them? And one of the models that I always advocate for is taking younger people who are activists, who are maybe really feeling frustrated sometimes that you cannot do as much to help children and adolescents right now. Seniors really could benefit from your advocacy. Study after study shows that even with cisgender people, if you have a younger adult that visits you, like in a care home, you will get better care. I always joke that as I get older, if I didn't have younger people in my life, I would rent a younger person to come and visit me. This is part of a youth-oriented culture, that having a younger person there to kind of watch what's going on with you, that you'll just be better cared for. So we also know that older adults who identify as trans are more likely to smoke nicotine, more likely to drink alcohol to excess, abuse and misuse prescription drugs, engage in HIV high-risk behavior. What is all of that about? Like internalized transphobia, internalized self-hatred, feeling like this is kind of hopeless. And I was hearing, as Jude Patton was saying, people are amazed that, quote, he's still alive. And I think there's even more than of this kind of hopelessness that I've encountered over the years with trans folks of not really having role models who are older, or literally imagining that you're just not going to live that long, that somehow all this discrimination or hormones or surgery or whatever it is going to shorten your life expectancy. And so it's as if there's even more of this kind of sad, tragic, woeful sort of way of looking at the end of life. And it's so is not like that. It doesn't have to be like that. If you plan for the future, it is more likely to turn out the way that you want it to be. One of the exercises that I give my gerontological students, who are generally in their 20s, and they often give me feedback like, this was so much more positive than I thought it was going to be. So they come in with all these negative expectations, is drawing a picture of yourself as an older adult, however you define an older adult, somebody over 50, somebody over 80, so that you could imagine that. And we know from other marginalized communities that it's very difficult when you don't have these role models of this is going to be me, this could be me kind of thing. Where would you want to live? The best place to live is in a big urban environment where there are many resources for you. When you get older, you don't want to live like out in a rural area, let alone in terms of the issues with healthcare. Who will actually advocate for you? And so instead of kind of saying, this is very difficult, I don't have family, I'm not out to other people, would you be open to reaching out to younger, like trans activists to help you, to be there for you, to connect you to other services even? And what is your support system? When you draw a picture of yourself as an older person, who would actually be in your life? And what sort of lifestyle would you have? Because despite the panelists have kind of touched on, and that actually was attributed to Betty Davis, that aging is not for, quote, sissies, there are many people in their hundreds in the United States that live all by themselves. They have people come in and, you know, do their cooking, cleaning, shopping, this kind of stuff for them. But aging is not a disease. I have 2 slides, that's all, of things that happen as you get older. We used to believe that so many things that were related to aging, now we say that they're disease. Even Alzheimer's disease, we really don't understand what that is. And most dementias, of which Alzheimer's disease is one of the dementias, is reversible. So my big concern often would be, certainly for people who are more marginalized and out there living closeted in stealth, is they're not getting a lot of information about this. So how do you actually access medical care? And what's been wonderful with the pandemic, even with some of my quite elderly clients in their 90s, is they're much more comfortable doing things online and reaching out to other organizations for information. One of the things that I would love to see addressed, certainly in the standards of care, the latest one that just came out from WPATH that has nothing about older adults in it, which tells you something again about the interest in that, is we have very little information about what happens long-term as you take hormone replacement therapy 30, 40, 50 years. What happens if you've had body modification surgeries? And what does that do long-term? Are there issues then with your bladder, for example? Are there issues if you've not ever had your prostate removed? And no one really seems to talk about these kinds of things. Are trans people more likely to develop problems from this? So I'm hoping as we go forward in having awareness of this, and some of just the practical things for, I think, younger activists to get people funding to research this. And if you are going to be in a facility, which I hope that you're not, how is that going to work for you? One of the things that I often get kind of some really interesting looks when I present to probably mostly hundreds of cis people is when I bring up the issue that most care facilities are divided by gender body, I'll just say. This is where the male body people are, this is the female body people are. So how's that going to work for you if you don't fit into those categories? And like potentially even GLB identified people, this is a practical thing sometimes where people are actually bathing you. So you can see huge issues with abuse, with neglect, with not wanting to really even accept you into the facility. And so I think we have a lot to cover in this way, as they have addressed a little bit in the GLB community of having facilities that are designated for folks that have that identification. But some trans folks may not want to be in a facility that's identified in that way. One of these old pioneers that I had the pleasure of meeting years ago, Virginia Prince, who was a very outspoken, in-your-face sort of person. She lived into her 90s. And when she was in this care home in later life, even she was very skittish about people knowing about her past. And so the person with that kind of personality becoming skittish and frightened, I could imagine for the average person how difficult that would be. And I'm hoping going forward that we can put all of our heads together to figure out what's a way to address this. And end of life, right? What's going to happen? How are you going to live the last few days of your life? What are your desires? We know in a youth-oriented culture, people typically don't even come up with a will. They don't talk about their desires. In the United States, we call it an advance directive about what you want to have done or not have done in terms of keeping you alive. If you don't plan for these things, it's far less likely to happen, and obviously becomes significantly more complicated if there are identity issues in this way, that some people know about your past prior to transition and some people don't. So my job here was to just like stir up a whole lot of your kind of neurons in your brain of thinking about all this stuff, whether you want to think about it or not, because we are all aging, as we started this panel with. It's not a disease. And the biggest predictor of how long you're going to live is typically how long your ancestors lived. So you could be in it for the long haul. why not see it as something to embrace, to be positive, and to help other people? I think coming together as a community, that we really can help each other, as many other marginalized communities have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. That was great. So everybody ready to fight back? Yes. All right.